In January 1942, the war arrived on America's doorstep without warning. Just beyond the darkened horizon, oil tankers burned in open water, their flames rising high enough to silhouette coastal hotels, boardwalks, and city skylines. Vacation lights still glowed along the shore. Cars still moved along beachfront roads. And offshore, men were dying within sight of a country that had not yet learned how to protect them. German U-boats surfaced boldly, sometimes lingering long enough for their commanders to observe the coastline through binoculars. What they saw astonished them. Ships sailed alone. Navigation lights shone freely. No escorts appeared. The Atlantic, which had devoured convoys for 2 years in Europe, now offered targets with almost careless regularity. To the men in steel hulls beneath the waves, it felt less like combat than opportunity. The silence did not last. Radios crackled to life with frantic distress, calls civilian voices breaking under pressure as torpedoes struck without warning. Some messages ended mid-sentence. Others repeated coordinates that no one was ready to answer. Lifeboats filled with oil-soaked survivors drifted through shipping lanes that had suddenly become graveyards. The United States Navy faced an enemy it could not see and did not yet understand. Its doctrine had been built for fleet engagements, not invisible predators hunting commerce. Destroyers were scattered, aircraft were scarce. The coastline itself had never been considered a battlefield. Now it was one. For merchant sailors, the illusion of safety vanished overnight. They had signed on to carry fuel, food, and steel, not to serve as bait. Yet they quickly understood the truth. In this war, the cargo ship was no longer a civilian vessel. It was a target, and its crew was expendable in the arithmetic of submarine warfare. Newspapers struggled to keep pace. Each morning brought new reports of sinkings closer to shore, of bodies washing up on beaches, of questions no official briefing could fully answer. The public sensed a failure unfolding in real time, even as explanations lagged behind the losses. Before America could mobilize its strength, before it could organize its defenses, the Atlantic had already turned red, and beneath the surface, the hunters were only just beginning. The Germans called it Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat. It was conceived not as a gamble, but as a demonstration. In Berlin, planners understood that America's sudden entry into the war had not yet translated into readiness. They knew the coastline was long, defenses thin, and experience scarce. What followed was not subtle strategy, but calculated exploitation, carried out with ruthless efficiency. U-boat captains arriving off the American seaboard encountered a situation few had imagined possible. Merchant ships sailed independently, spaced wide apart, following predictable routes. There were no disciplined convoys, no constant escorts, no layered defenses. For submariners hardened by years of brutal Atlantic combat, it felt like a return to an earlier, easier War I. The enemy had not yet learned how to fight. At night, the advantage grew sharper. Coastal cities resisted blackouts, unwilling to dim their lights for a distant conflict. The result was devastating clarity. Ships at sea appeared in stark silhouette against glowing skylines, their outlines framed by hotels, street lamps, and amusement piers. U-boat commanders scarcely needed sonar. They aimed by sight alone. The numbers climbed with alarming speed. Sinkings rose to levels unseen since the darkest days of 1917. Tankers exploded in sheets of fire. Cargo ships vanished between sunset and dawn. German logs recorded patrols where torpedoes were expended not for lack of targets, but for lack of restraint. The enemy did not stalk from shadows, it hunted in plain view. Survivors told similar stories. No warning, no time. A dull thud, then tearing steel, followed by darkness and burning oil. Some crews never saw the submarine that killed them. Others glimpsed its conning tower briefly, exposed and unafraid, before it slipped away to find another victim. For Americans watching from shore, the realization came slowly, then all at once. This was not a distant war fought across oceans. It was here. It moved silently beneath familiar waters. It turned coastlines into front lines and civilians into witnesses. The drumbeat echoed relentlessly across the Atlantic, each sinking reinforcing the same brutal message. Distance no longer offered protection. And as the U-boats pressed their advantage, a deeper question emerged: how long could this imbalance last before someone was forced to answer it? The early weeks of 1942 exposed a difficult truth. The United States Navy had entered a modern naval war carrying ideas shaped by an earlier one. Its doctrine was fragmented, built around fleet engagements and decisive surface battles, not the slow, grinding protection of commerce against an unseen enemy. What worked on paper failed at sea, and the Atlantic showed no patience for theory. The practical shortages were immediate and severe. Destroyers designed to hunt submarines were few, many already committed elsewhere. Aircraft capable of long-range patrol were limited in number and range. Sonar existed, but it was unevenly deployed, unfamiliar to many crews, and poorly integrated into a coherent system. The coastline stretched for thousands of miles. The tools to defend it did not. Across the ocean, warnings had already been written in wreckage. British officers, hardened by years of submarine warfare, urged convoy systems, blackouts, and constant escort. Their advice arrived with urgency and experience behind it. Yet much of it was received cautiously, sometimes dismissed outright. Pride, habit, and bureaucratic inertia proved stubborn obstacles, even as ships continued to disappear. Inside command rooms, arguments replaced answers. Admirals debated priorities, allocations, and responsibility, while merchant crews faced torpedoes without protection. Each delay widened what became known as the Atlantic Gap, a space not merely of geography, but of capability. Within it, U-boats operated with growing confidence, their patrols longer, their logs fuller, their commanders increasingly certain of their advantage. German reports reflected the imbalance clearly. American responses were sporadic. Escorts appeared, then vanished. Air patrols turned back before nightfall. The sea, vast and indifferent, rewarded consistency and punished hesitation. With every successful patrol, German belief hardened into expectation. For the United States, the realization came gradually. This was not a problem that could be solved by reassurance or improvisation alone. The war demanded something different, something faster, simpler, and scalable. But what that solution looked like remained unclear. As the Atlantic continued to claim ships and lives, America began searching not just for a weapon, but for a new way of thinking. And somewhere beyond the arguments and assumptions, an answer was beginning to take shape, one few were yet ready to accept. In the opening months of 1942, belief hardened into assumption. Within the U.S. Navy, the prevailing conviction was clear and rarely questioned. Only modern steel warships could defeat modern steel submarines. The answer, it was believed, lay in speed, armor, and firepower in destroyers built to outpace and overwhelm the enemy beneath the waves. Anything less was considered a compromise, and in war, compromise was equated with failure. But belief collided quickly with reality. Destroyers could not be conjured at will. Production schedules stretched under the weight of global war, and every hull laid down competed with demands from the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and the Arctic routes to Russia. Engines, guns, radar sets, all arrived slower than needed. On paper, the solution existed. In the water, it did not. American shipyards strained to their limits. Steel was rationed. Skilled labor was scarce. Slipways were crowded with vessels at every stage of completion, each one critical, none arriving fast enough. The pace of construction, impressive by peacetime standards, was irrelevant against the daily arithmetic of sinkings. For every escort launched, several ships were lost. Despite this imbalance, high command remained skeptical of alternatives. Smaller vessels were viewed as inadequate, too lightly armed, too fragile, too limited in endurance. Wooden hulls, in particular, carried the stigma of obsolescence. They belonged to an earlier era, not to a war defined by sonar, depth charges, and steel pressure hulls. Doctrine, once written, resisted revision. Across the Atlantic, German submariners observed these delays with confidence and a measure of contempt. Captains joked in patrol logs about American responses that appeared improvised and inconsistent. The absence of sustained escort presence reinforced a dangerous impression that the United States understood the problem but lacked the will or imagination to solve it quickly. Each successful patrol strengthened that belief. Technology remained the Navy's refuge. Radar would improve. New destroyers would arrive. Faster ships would restore control. The logic was internally sound, but it ignored the one variable no factory could accelerate: time. While plans matured and steel took shape in shipyards, the U-boats continued to sail, to hunt, and to return with results. The Atlantic did not pause for production schedules or doctrinal debates. It rewarded only what was present, not what was promised. And in those early months, presence belonged overwhelmingly to the enemy. As confidence in future solutions grew, losses in the present mounted. Somewhere between faith and necessity, a quiet realization was forming, one that challenged everything the Navy believed about what a warship was supposed to be. But that realization had not yet found its voice. The proposal did not come from admirals or war colleges. It emerged instead from civilian designers and engineers, men accustomed to solving problems with materials at hand, not ideals inherited from past wars. They had watched the sinkings accumulate, the delays stretch longer, and the gap widen. Their conclusion was unsettlingly simple. The Navy did not need perfection. It needed presence. What they offered sounded, at first, like desperation. Small vessels, inexpensive, built not from steel, but from wood. Ships that could be produced quickly in civilian boatyards, powered by commercial engines, and armed just well enough to harass a submarine into breaking off an attack. They were not designed to dominate the sea. They were designed to deny it. Naval traditionalists recoiled. To them, wood belonged to the age of sail, not to a war of sonar and depth charges. A wooden hull seemed an invitation to disaster vulnerable to shrapnel, blast, and fire. Such vessels could not chase, outgun, or outlast a modern U-boat. At best, they would be a distraction. At worst, a liability. The resistance was not merely technical. It was philosophical. Doctrine had long equated strength with size, survivability with steel. The idea that speed, numbers, and simplicity could compensate for individual weakness challenged deeply held assumptions about naval power. Quantity had always been a supporting factor, never the strategy itself. Yet the logic refused to disappear. Wooden ships could be built where steel warships could not. Civilian yards, many idle or underutilized, could be mobilized almost immediately. Crews could be trained faster. Losses, while inevitable, would not cripple production. What these vessels lacked in endurance, they could replace with coverage. What they lacked in armor, they could offset with unpredictability. The proposal survived not because it was loved, but because alternatives were absent. Steel escorts would come eventually. Aircraft coverage would expand someday. But the Atlantic demanded something now. Faced with a choice between an imperfect solution and no solution at all, resistance softened into reluctant acceptance. The authorization was quiet, almost embarrassed. No grand announcement followed. No doctrine was rewritten. The project was approved as a stopgap, a temporary measure to buy time until real warships arrived. Few believed it would matter. But wars have a way of elevating what survives, not what is celebrated. And in that moment of institutional doubt, a gamble was placed, one built not on faith and tradition, but on the urgency of necessity. Design work began without ceremony. The vessel would measure just 110 feet short by naval standards, narrow in beam, and unapologetically simple. It would become known as the SC-class submarine chaser, a ship conceived not to impress, but to exist in large numbers. There was no time for refinement. Every decision was filtered through a single question: how fast can it be built? Elegance vanished early in the process. Curved lines and bespoke fittings gave way to straight timbers and standardized components. Blueprints were simplified so they could be read by civilian craftsmen unfamiliar with naval conventions. What mattered was repeatability. One design. Hundreds of hulls. Speed over beauty. Function over pride. To achieve that scale, the Navy turned outward. Civilian boatyards, some accustomed to fishing trawlers, others to pleasure craft, were pulled abruptly into the war. Their workers learned new tolerances, new terminology, and new urgency. The smell of resin and fresh-cut wood mixed with the weight of unspoken knowledge. These vessels were being built to fight, and many would not return. Training followed the same logic. Crews were assembled quickly, often young men with little sea time and less experience of combat. Instruction was compressed, focused on essentials: how to read sonar returns, how to drop depth charges, how to keep engines running under strain. There was no space for mastery, only for adequacy. Life aboard the SC-class was unforgiving. The ships were lightly armed, carrying depth charges, small-caliber guns, and little else. Their engines roared relentlessly. filling every compartment with vibration and noise. Quarters were cramped to the point of exhaustion. Sleep came in fragments. Silence was rare. Comfort, non-existent. Skepticism followed them into the water. Officers questioned their survivability. Sailors doubted their purpose. Compared to steel destroyers, the wooden chasers seemed fragile, almost provisional, as if they belonged to a test rather than a war. Even their crews understood the implication. These ships were not expected to endure, only to engage. Yet they sailed. One after another, they slipped into coastal waters and convoy lanes where nothing else was available. There were no ceremonies, no confident speeches, only orders, and the knowledge that absence was worse than imperfection. The Atlantic did not care what they were made of. It cared only that someone was finally there. And as the first wooden hulls took up patrol, a new struggle began, not just against U-boats, but against doubt itself. For the wooden submarine chasers, sight mattered less than sound. Lacking the speed and firepower to dominate by force, they depended instead on listening. Sonar, still an imperfect and often misunderstood technology, became their most vital weapon. It transformed the ocean from empty space into a map of echoes, where survival depended on interpretation rather than strength. At first, those echoes were deceptive. The sea was alive with noise. Whales passed beneath the hulls, their massive bodies reflecting sound in ways that mimicked steel. Schools of fish scattered and regrouped. Thermal layers bent signals unpredictably. Crews learned quickly that sonar did not deliver certainty, only possibility. The task was not to hear something, but to decide what it meant. This learning curve was unforgiving. Early contacts often dissolved into confusion. A promising return would vanish without explanation. Attacks were launched on assumptions rather than confirmation. Depth charges exploded into empty water, churning the sea but achieving nothing. Each failed engagement reinforced the fear that these ships were inadequate, their crews unprepared, their mission futile. Yet torpedoes were no longer the measure of success. The submarine chasers were not built to duel. Their purpose was denial, to force U-boats deeper, to disrupt attacks, to make every approach costly. Depth charges replaced torpedoes as the tools of survival. Crude by later standards, they were nonetheless effective when used persistently. Even near misses could crack fittings, damage instruments, and erode morale below the surface. Patrols stretched on relentlessly. The wooden hulls vibrated without pause, engines hammering through day and night. Sleep came in brief intervals, often interrupted by alarms or contact reports. Fatigue dulled judgment. Uncertainty followed every decision. Was the contact real? Had the submarine escaped? Or had it never been there at all? Each engagement became a lesson. Crews began to recognize patterns, how a true submarine contact held steady while biological noise wandered, how changes in speed altered returns, how evasive maneuvers sounded different from passive drift. Experienced operators learned to trust instinct tempered by repetition. What had once been guesswork slowly became craft. Mistakes were still common, but they became instructive rather than paralyzing. Officers shared experiences between patrols. Reports were circulated, tactics adjusted. The chasers learned when to press an attack and when to maintain contact, when patience mattered more than aggression. The sea, once overwhelming, began to feel legible. This incremental learning had consequences beyond individual ships. U-boats, accustomed to brief engagements followed by clean escapes, now faced persistent pursuit. Wooden chasers could linger where larger escorts could not, returning again and again to the same waters. Even when no kill was achieved, the pressure mounted. Submarine commanders reported interrupted attacks, damaged confidence, and growing exhaustion. What changed was not technology alone, but perception. The crews stopped seeing themselves as temporary measures. They began to understand their role within a larger system, one where detection mattered as much as destruction. Every contact forced a decision below the surface. Every depth charge reminded the hunter that it was no longer alone. Slowly, patterns emerged not just in sound, but in outcomes. Sinkings did not vanish overnight, but they became harder to achieve. U-boats spent more time evading than attacking. The balance, once overwhelmingly tilted, began to shift in small, measurable ways. The wooden ships were still fragile. Their crews were still learning. But for the first time, the Atlantic felt contested not by superior force, but by persistent attention. And as that attention multiplied, so did its effect, setting the stage for a change no single engagement could yet explain. The change did not arrive as a single moment, but as accumulation. One wooden submarine chaser did little to alter the balance of the Atlantic. Hundreds did. By mid-1942, the sea lanes began to fill with small silhouettes unremarkable individually, but persistent in their presence. The Atlantic, once defined by absence, grew crowded. What each ship lacked in speed, endurance, or armament was compensated by proximity. There was no longer a long stretch of open water between escorts. Patrol zones overlapped, gaps closed. For the first time, convoys moved under near-constant watch. Their vulnerability reduced not by invincibility, but by continuity. Protection became a condition rather than an event. This was a reversal of long-held assumptions. Naval tradition favored singular excellence, fewer ships, better ships, decisive engagements. The wooden chasers inverted that logic. They were not designed to win battles alone. They were designed to deny freedom of movement. Individual weakness became collective strength, not through coordination alone, but through sheer inevitability. Convoys grew denser and more disciplined. Ships sailed closer together, their courses guarded by rings of escorts that included vessels once dismissed as temporary. Attacks that might have succeeded months earlier were now interrupted almost immediately. A periscope sighting triggered response. A sonar contact drew attention. The U-boat's greatest weapon surprise began to erode. German patrol reports reflected the shift. Where captains had once recorded plentiful targets and minimal interference, they now described frequent contacts, constant harassment, and shortened patrols. Time submerged increased. Battery life decreased. Opportunities vanished as escorts arrived sooner and lingered longer. The sea, once accommodating, grew hostile. Stress followed naturally. Submarine crews slept less, listened more, and acted with increasing caution. Every echo carried consequence. Every decision to surface or attack involved greater risk. Even when attacks succeeded, escape became uncertain. The psychological burden of persistent pursuit began to outweigh the rewards of aggression. For American crews, the change was quieter but equally profound. The wooden chasers found themselves less isolated, operating as part of a network rather than an exception. Confidence did not come from individual heroism, but from repetition. Patrol after patrol, contact after contact, they learned that presence alone could shape outcomes. The Atlantic began to resemble a chessboard rather than an open field. Moves were anticipated, responses layered. The U-boat, once the undisputed predator, now had to consider the possibility that every approach would be contested, not by a single superior adversary, but by many adequate ones. Quantity reshaped the battle in ways doctrine had not predicted. It did not eliminate loss. Ships still sank. Men still died. But the rate changed. The rhythm slowed. What had been a rout became a struggle. What had been effortless became costly. The wooden ships had not won the Atlantic, but they had altered its character. The sea no longer belonged to those who struck first. It belonged increasingly to those who stayed. And as the hunters multiplied, the consequences of that persistence were about to become unmistakable. Below deck, the war was never abstract. It vibrated through the hull and settled into the bones. The engines never truly stopped, their constant roar filling every compartment with heat and motion. Conversation required shouting. Silence, when it came, felt unnatural. The wooden submarine chasers were small, and every inch of space was shared with machinery, with equipment, and with other men enduring the same confinement. Sleep became a fragmented luxury. Watches rotated without regard for circadian rhythm, and rest came in short intervals, interrupted by alarms, course changes, or sonar contacts that demanded immediate attention. Exhaustion was not an exception. It was the baseline. Men learned to function while tired, to calculate while strained, to listen while their bodies asked for stillness they would not receive. Fear was present, but it was rarely discussed. There was no illusion of safety aboard a lightly armed wooden ship hunting steel submarines. Crews understood the imbalance instinctively. A single well-placed torpedo could erase them. A depth charge mishandled could do the same. Fear, therefore, was not something to overcome, it was something to manage. It was compartmentalized, controlled, and carried quietly. Many of the sailors were young, some barely out of training. They adapted with a speed that surprised their superiors. Where doctrine hesitated, experience taught. They learned which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. They learned how long they could push their bodies before judgment suffered. Innovation came not from manuals, but from repetition under pressure. Mistakes carried consequences that were immediate and unforgiving. A misread sonar contact wasted precious time. A poorly timed maneuver broke contact. A depth charge set too shallow or too deep achieved nothing. In some cases, errors proved fatal not only for the crew of the chaser, but for the convoy they were meant to protect. Responsibility weighed heavily, even when outcomes could not be controlled. And yet, something changed over time. Confidence did not arrive with celebration or bravado. It crept in quietly, almost unnoticed. Crews began to trust their routines. Operators recognized patterns without conscious effort. Decisions were made faster, with fewer words. Success was measured not in kills, but in uneventful crossings, convoys that arrived intact, nights that passed without explosions. The wooden chasers were never glamorous assignments. There were no headlines for long patrols that ended in nothing happening. But the absence of catastrophe became its own validation. Each safe arrival suggested that the work mattered, even if it left no visible mark. Below deck, belief took hold not in invulnerability, but in purpose. The sailors understood their limits, but they also understood their effect. They were no longer placeholders or temporary measures. They were part of a system that worked because it endured. The hunters did not see themselves as heroes. They did not speak of turning points. They spoke of watches, contacts, and fuel states. But beneath that language, a quiet conviction formed. They were no longer reacting to the war. They were shaping it. And as that belief settled in, the struggle above the waves began to tilt subtly at first, then unmistakably toward a new phase of the Atlantic War. The change announced itself quietly, almost reluctantly, in the numbers. At first, it was easy to dismiss a single U-boat lost here, another damaged there. Statistical noise, some argued. But as weeks passed, the pattern hardened. Sinkings of German submarines began to rise measurably, not in dramatic spikes, but in a steady accumulation that could no longer be ignored. In Berlin, confidence gave way to scrutiny. Reports from returning commanders carried a different tone than before. Patrols were shorter. Encounters were more frequent. Attacks were interrupted with increasing regularity. Submarines returned with damaged hulls, malfunctioning systems, and crews pushed to exhaustion. The assumption that American waters offered easy hunting began to fracture under evidence. Patrol zones shrank as a result. Areas once considered permissive were reclassified as dangerous. Routes were adjusted. Risk was redistributed, but the sea did not reset itself. Every contraction brought U-boats into tighter spaces, where defenses overlapped and escape routes narrowed. The Atlantic, once vast and forgiving, became constrained by attention. At the same time, Allied coordination improved with remarkable speed. Information flowed faster between ships, aircraft, and shore commands. Sonar contacts were shared. Patterns of movement were tracked. Lessons learned by one crew were absorbed by others. What had once been isolated efforts became a system adaptive, cumulative, and increasingly effective. The Atlantic Gap, the lethal absence that had defined early 1942, began to close. It did not vanish entirely, but it narrowed enough to matter. Continuous escort became more common. Air coverage extended further offshore. Wooden submarine chasers filled spaces larger ships could not. The sea grew layered, watched from above, scanned below, and patrolled across its surface. Then came the confirmation few had expected. Wooden ships began to claim steel kills. These were not dramatic duels. There were no broadsides exchanged, no prolonged chases captured in after-action reports. Instead, there were sonar contacts held long enough to matter, depth charge patterns repeated with patience. Submarines forced deeper, trapped by damage or depleted batteries. Some never returned. For the crews aboard the wooden chasers, success felt unreal at first. The vessels had been dismissed as temporary, inadequate, and expendable, yet here they were, contributing directly to the destruction of the enemy, not through superiority, but through persistence, not through brilliance, but through presence. German command recognized the implication with growing unease. The enemy had not merely improved, it had adapted. The Atlantic was no longer a space where skill alone guaranteed survival. It was an environment saturated with risk, shaped by countless small decisions made by crews who refused to leave it empty. Momentum shifted without ceremony. There was no declaration, no clear date marking the reversal. Ships still sank, men still died, but the balance of expectation changed. U-boat commanders no longer assumed safe passage home. American escorts no longer assumed helplessness. The psychological center of gravity moved. What had begun as an emergency measure, wooden ships built in haste, had become part of a broader transformation. The Atlantic was no longer defined by German initiative alone. It had become contested space, governed by endurance rather than audacity. The tide had turned not because of a single innovation or decisive battle, but because the war had been forced into a form the U-boats could no longer dominate. And as that realization settled in, the struggle entered its most punishing phase one, where survival depended not on attack, but on endurance beneath relentless pressure. By late 1942, the Atlantic had become a different ocean for those who traveled beneath it. U-boats no longer faced a single threat, but a sequence of them. Layered defenses now awaited every approach: surface escorts, aircraft patrols, sonar nets, and the persistent presence of small ships that refused to leave. What had once been open water had become a system. In this environment, escape grew harder than attack. A successful torpedo run no longer marked the end of danger, but the beginning of it. Depth charges followed quickly, sometimes within minutes, sometimes hours later. Chasers handed contacts to aircraft. Aircraft drove submarines back toward waiting escorts. The sea closed in through coordination rather than force. Survivors spoke of the pressure as constant. There was no single dramatic chase, but a series of interruptions that denied rest and certainty. Submarines were forced to remain submerged longer, draining batteries and oxygen. Repairs were attempted in darkness and silence. The sound of propellers overhead no longer faded away. It circled, returned, and multiplied. Morale eroded slowly, then decisively. The psychological burden of being hunted weighed heavier than any mechanical failure. Crews listened to the hull creak under depth, to explosions that rattled fittings and nerves alike. Every sonar ping carried intention. Every depth charge suggested patience. The Atlantic no longer felt neutral, it felt hostile. Above the surface, a quieter transformation was underway. American crews, once uncertain and reactive, gained confidence not from victory speeches, but from routine success. Contacts were held, convoys arrived. Patrols ended without catastrophe. The absence of disaster became evidence of control. Each engagement began to feel decisive, not because every contact ended in destruction, but because every contact mattered. A submarine forced to dive deep was a submarine not attacking. A damaged hull meant a shortened patrol. Attrition replaced confrontation as the dominant logic of the war at sea. The hunters now controlled the tempo. They decided when contact began and when it ended. They forced submarines to respond rather than initiate. Time, once the ally of the U-boat, shifted sides. Long patrols favored endurance, not daring. And endurance now belonged to those who could remain present the longest. German command recognized the change with growing alarm. Losses mounted not just in numbers, but in experience. Veteran crews were harder to replace. Training pipelines stretched thin. New boats entered service into an environment far more lethal than the one their predecessors had faced. The advantage of surprise, once decisive, had been consumed by familiarity. For the wooden chasers, this phase of the war brought no sense of triumph. Their ships remained vulnerable. Their work remained exhausting. But they now operated with clarity of purpose. They were not temporary measures. They were components of a machine that functioned because it never stopped. The Atlantic War had become one of attrition, measured not by spectacular victories, but by cumulative pressure. It was fought in hours without sleep, in-depth charge patterns repeated until patience replaced fear. The outcome would not be decided by a single battle, but by which side could endure the longest under relentless scrutiny. Beneath the waves, the hunters were no longer free. Above them, the watchers did not leave. And as the tempo held, the consequences of that imbalance began to ripple outward, reshaping not just the war at sea, but the war itself. The Atlantic continued to take lives long after the tide had turned. Ships still burned. Men still vanished into cold water. But these losses no longer arrived as shocking headlines. They became statistics, absorbed into reports and summaries that measured progress by comparison rather than catastrophe. The war at sea had entered a quieter phase one, defined not by spectacle, but by endurance. For the crews of the wooden submarine chasers, danger remained immediate and personal. Their hulls, built for speed and availability rather than protection, absorbed shrapnel and shockwaves with alarming intimacy. Depth charge blasts meant to kill below often punished those above. Planks flexed, fastenings loosened. Men were thrown against bulkheads. Survival depended as much on resilience as on design. Losses were accepted with a grim understanding. Ships failed to return. Crews were reassigned without ceremony. There were no illusions left about invulnerability. Progress carried a cost, and that cost was paid incrementally, without pause. What changed was the meaning attached to sacrifice. It no longer felt futile. Each loss contributed to a system that increasingly worked. Across the Atlantic, the strain showed in German production figures. Submarine losses outpaced replacements. Skilled crews were irreplaceable at the rate they were being consumed. New boats entered service into an environment saturated with defenses. Their effectiveness diminished before they could mature. The arithmetic of attrition turned unforgiving. Meanwhile, the convoy system stabilized. Routes hardened into routines. Schedules held. Escorts remained with their charges from departure to arrival. Wooden chasers filled gaps that once swallowed ships whole. The sea lanes, though never safe, became predictable enough to trust. That trust was everything. Supply lines began to hold. Fuel reached ports. Food crossed oceans. Steel arrived where factories demanded it. The war's vast machinery, aircraft production, armored divisions, amphibious planning depended on this invisible flow. Without it, victories elsewhere would have remained theoretical. With it, they became possible. This was the Atlantic's true contribution. Not decisive battles or dramatic reversals, but continuity. The ability to move resources across water without interruption. Victory took shape not in explosions, but in tonnage delivered and schedules met. Logistics replaced heroics as the measure of success. The wooden ships rarely appeared in photographs. Their crews returned without parades. Their stories blended into operational summaries and shipping tallies, yet their impact was disproportionate to their size. They had helped create an environment where loss no longer dictated outcome. The Atlantic remained red in places marked by oil, slicks, wreckage, and memory, but it no longer bled uncontrollably. Control had replaced chaos, and persistence had reshaped the war's foundation. As the focus of conflict shifted toward continents and capitals, the work of these ships faded from attention, but the system they helped build endured, carrying the war forward on quiet, relentless momentum. And in that momentum, the final consequences of their gamble were only beginning to be understood. As the war pressed forward, attention shifted toward scale. The machines grew larger, louder, more visible. Aircraft carriers displaced towns. Bombers crossed continents. Armored divisions rolled through capitals. Against this backdrop, the wooden submarine chasers slipped from view not because they failed, but because the war no longer needed them in the same way. Recognition was scarce even at the time. There were no victory photographs of wooden hulls riding triumphantly into harbor. No headlines marked the end of their patrols. Their success had been measured in absences in ships that did not sink, routes that did not collapse, emergencies that did not occur. History rarely pauses to celebrate what quietly holds. When victory came, crews dispersed without ceremony. Sailors returned to civilian life carrying memories that resisted narrative. They had not stormed beaches or flown missions deep into enemy territory. They had listened, waited, endured. Many never spoke of it. Their war had been repetitive, exhausting, and often invisible even to those it protected. Steel fleets took center stage in the official record. Destroyers, escort carriers, and long-range aircraft became the symbols of maritime dominance restored. The story was framed as one of technological maturation, better radar, improved coordination, refined doctrine. These accounts were accurate, but incomplete. They described what finished the job, not what made finishing possible. The Atlantic remembers differently. It does not organize memory by prestige or tonnage, but by continuity. It remembers the months when loss threatened to overwhelm production, when absence mattered more than power. In that memory, the wooden ships remain present, not as heroes, but as constants. The records support this quieter version of events. When analyzed without bias toward scale, they reveal disproportionate impact. Wooden chasers filled patrol hours no one else could. They closed gaps before steel could arrive. They forced submarines to dive, retreat, and waste time. Their effect was cumulative, statistical, and undeniable. They changed probabilities, and in war, probability is often destiny. Yet history prefers simplicity. It compresses timelines. It attributes outcomes to decisive moments and singular solutions. Complexity is flattened into inevitability. In that process, the wooden fleet becomes an anecdote rather than a foundation, a footnote to success rather than a condition of it. What is lost in that simplification is the lesson. Victory in the Atlantic was not achieved by perfection. It was achieved by adequacy applied relentlessly, by solutions that arrived early rather than ideal ones that arrived late, by accepting vulnerability in exchange for presence, by understanding that control is often built from repetition, not dominance. The wooden ships embodied that truth. They were never meant to last. They were built to hold, to occupy space long enough for something better to follow. And they did. By the time larger machines took over, the balance had already shifted. The sea had been shaped. Today, few of those hulls remain. Some rotted at their moorings. Others were broken apart for scrap. Their disappearance mirrors their service: functional, unceremonious, complete. What remains is the effect they left behind, embedded in outcomes rather than monuments. History may simplify what was complex, but the Atlantic resists that instinct. It remembers that the war at sea was not saved by brilliance alone, but by endurance. And in that endurance, the forgotten fleet still holds its place, quietly, persistently, beneath the surface of the story. In the aftermath of survival, reflection followed, not immediately and not comfortably. The Navy did not rush to celebrate its improvisations. Institutions rarely do. But as reports were reviewed and outcomes compared, a quiet truth emerged. The Atlantic had been held not by the most advanced ideas of the pre-war years, but by solutions born of urgency and restraint. Speed had mattered more than elegance. Adaptability had mattered more than design purity. The wooden submarine chasers were never intended to redefine naval warfare. Yet they had done precisely that by forcing a reconsideration of what effectiveness actually meant. They arrived early, in numbers, and they stayed. In a war governed by time, that was decisive. Arrogance had nearly lost the Atlantic. Not the arrogance of malice, but of certainty, the belief that existing doctrine would naturally prevail, that superior technology would inevitably arrive in time. Those assumptions delayed action at the moment delay was most dangerous. The sea exposed them mercilessly. Technology did matter. Sonar improved. Aircraft extended reach. Coordination tightened. But technology alone did not save the convoys. What mattered equally was humility, the willingness to accept imperfect tools, to revise assumptions, to learn from failure without defensiveness. The Atlantic rewarded adaptation, not pride. This lesson reached beyond naval architecture. It spoke to the nature of problem-solving under pressure. When confronted with collapse, the instinct is often to wait for the correct answer. The Atlantic demonstrated the cost of that instinct. What saved the system was not correctness, but adequacy applied relentlessly. Small tools reshaped large outcomes. Wooden hulls forced steel submarines to reconsider every approach. Limited endurance multiplied through coverage. Modest capability accumulated into control. None of this aligned neatly with pre-war theory, yet all of it proved decisive in practice. Doctrine, once thought immutable, bent under necessity. It did not break all at once. It adjusted quietly, incorporating lessons without fully acknowledging their source. By the time steel fleets and long-range aircraft dominated the Atlantic, the conditions that allowed them to succeed had already been created by humbler means. The broader implication was uncomfortable but enduring. Systems fail not only because they lack strength, but because they resist change. Innovation rarely arrives in its ideal form. More often, it appears as compromise dismissed, doubted, and underestimated until circumstances force acceptance. The Navy would remember the Atlantic as a victory of coordination and industry. That memory was accurate, but incomplete. Beneath it lay a deeper lesson about timing, humility, and the value of acting before certainty arrives. The wooden ships embodied that lesson not through design, but through consequence. Beyond war, the pattern repeats. Crises do not wait for perfect solutions. They reward those who move, adapt, and learn in motion. Small interventions, applied early and persistently, can alter trajectories long before larger forces come into play. Necessity rewrites doctrine because necessity tolerates no delay. In the Atlantic, it stripped away assumptions and revealed priorities. Presence mattered, coverage mattered, endurance mattered. And when the moment demanded action, it was the willingness to accept imperfection that preserved the system. The wooden submarine chasers were never meant to teach philosophy. Yet their legacy rests not in tonnage sunk or battles won, but in a reminder as old as conflict itself. Survival belongs not to those who wait for the best answer, but to those who act with the means they have before time runs out. By the time the Atlantic was declared secure, it bore the marks of everything it had endured. Wreckage still lay scattered across its floor. Oil slicks lingered where ships had burned. Routes once synonymous with fear had become routine again. But the memory of vulnerability remained embedded in the sea's long silence. Control had been achieved, but it had not come without cost. Along quiet coastlines and secondary harbors, the wooden hulls waited. Some were tied up and forgotten. Others were stripped for parts, left to weather and rot where they lay. Their service life had been short, their usefulness exhausted by success. There were no preservation efforts, no ceremonial farewells. The war had moved on, and these ships had done what was asked of them. The enemy they hunted faded as well. The U-boat threat, once omnipresent, receded into statistics and after-action reports. The steel predators that had dominated the early months of the war became symbols of a failed assumption that initiative alone could guarantee victory. Their story, like that of the wooden ships, was absorbed into a larger narrative that favored outcomes over processes. What remained was the result. The Atlantic stayed open. Supplies crossed in volumes that sustained entire continents at war. Factories produced without interruption. Armies moved because ships arrived. The decisive moments of the conflict on beaches, in skies, across borders rested on this invisible foundation. Victory in the end belonged not to those with the most imposing machines, but to those who adapted fastest. The wooden submarine chasers were never the best answer. They were the first workable one. They arrived early, multiplied quickly, and refused to leave space unguarded. In doing so, they changed the conditions of the war. Steel did not save the Atlantic alone. It finished the task, refined it, and eventually dominated it. But steel arrived into an environment already reshaped by humbler means. By the time larger ships and advanced systems took over, the enemy had been worn down, constrained, and denied freedom of action. The hardest work had already been done. Wood, numbers, and resolve accomplished what doctrine had delayed. They filled gaps before theory caught up. They accepted vulnerability in exchange for presence. They demonstrated that control is often established long before superiority is achieved by those willing to endure repetition without recognition. There is a temptation, in hindsight, to see inevitability where there was once uncertainty, to assume that outcomes were always assured. The Atlantic does not support that view. It remembers how close collapse came, how assumptions failed, and how survival depended on decisions made without confidence in success. The wooden ships embodied an uncomfortable truth. Progress is rarely elegant in the moment it matters most. It is improvised, doubted, and often mocked. Its value becomes clear only later, when absence would have been catastrophic. They laughed at the wooden ships once. They laughed because the hulls looked fragile, because the material seemed outdated, because the idea offended tradition. They laughed because it did not resemble power as they understood it. They stopped laughing when the Atlantic closed around them. They never laughed again.